Good morning, colleagues. I'm Bill Nolan, president of the Practice Transition Division of the Williams Group. And we're going to do something a little different than we've normally done in the past. We've done quite a few webinars on different subjects that we think have been really helpful. But generally, they're 45 to 1 hour, and sometimes that just doesn't work with your patient schedules or lunch hours or things you might have going in your life. So today what we're going to do is just take apart some of that subject matter, transitioning your practice. And we're going to break it into 5 smaller vignettes and talk about some different topics. So first one we're going to talk about this morning is value. There's probably 50, maybe there's 500 different individual topics we could discuss about transitioning your practice. But we're going to talk about 5 that I think are probably pretty important. And of course, there'll be some contact information at the end of each of these. So if you have some questions for me or for our team, we'll be happy to answer them. Let's start today with value and the valuation of a practice. You know, value may not be the single most important element. In fact, often, to be honest with you, in today's world, it is not. There are many other things that seem like they are the kind of deal points that make a transaction either go or not go. But value is certainly a very important thing, no matter whether you're the buyer of a practice or the seller of a practice. If the buyer and seller, and no matter who that buyer, potential buyer is, if the buyer and the seller cannot agree or come to some agreement about the fundamental value of an optometric practice, it will be very difficult to move forward towards the other things. So let's talk a little bit about value. You know, generally, not always, but generally, an optometric practice for many people may be the single biggest transaction or asset sale that they ever do in their life. Many of you, I'm sure, hold stock in publicly traded companies, or you've bought mutual funds or index funds. Some of you may, often get involved in real estate transactions, but for most of the time, the sale of my practice is maybe the biggest single transaction that I'm ever going to do. It often, although this is probably for younger optometrists, but the sale of my practice is also a very big part of my retirement portfolio. So no matter how much money I put away, selling my optometric practice probably will be a little bit of the cherry on top of the sundae, because it generally, depending on the size of your practice, will put a very large amount of cash, even after tax. It'll put a fair amount of cash into your retirement portfolio. So if you think about value in today's world, and this is going to be kind of counterintuitive for most of you, and to be frank, it sometimes is a difficult idea or concept to get your arms around, because most optometrists, my father included, who practiced 51 or 52 years in Omaha, ophthalmic equipment, obviously the assets, the hard physical assets of your practice, is how most optometrists think. They think about all the money that they put into chairs and stands and slit lamps and phoropters and inventory and all those kind of things. And of course, those have great value, no question about it. But really in today's world, and especially in the banking and private equity world, the intrinsic value of an optometric practice is in the practice's, the business's ability to generate income. And so that is a really key component when we look at a practice. We look at the earnings component of the practice. You probably all now, especially because of private equity, you've heard a lot about EBITDA, which is an old accounting standard for getting your arms around the value of any kind of a business. EBITDA is an acronym. It stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So it gives someone, net of all those kind of subjective factors, it gives you a good idea of how much money is coming from the operations of the practice, of the business. And what we do, and what the banks do, and what private equity does, is once we determine what that earnings component is out of the business, we make an adjustment for reasonable compensation that will have to be paid to the owner, the seller, after the seller sells the practice. And so that becomes this adjusted EBITDA number, and that's the number that generally flows through all of private equity calculations. It flows through the Williams Group when we do our calculations. And when you get all said and done, the value of an optometric practice, selling the practice from one optometrist to another, or what we sometimes refer to as peer to peer, the value of that practice will be somewhere between 60 and 65% of revenue. So for example, if I have $1 million practice, and when I talk about $1 million, we're talking about that the practice generates $1 million of cash top line revenue, not $1 million of usual and customary fees, of which about a third is written off. But after write-offs, net of all my contractual adjustments, my practice did roughly $1 million. That practice typically would be worth somewhere between 600 and 650. Could be a little more, could be a little less. Just there's some factors, but as a rough and dirty number for you to kind of get your head around, if you're thinking about selling your practice and how much money that you want to put away for retirement, that's a good standard, good metric to give you a good idea about what a practice will sell for. And that's peer to peer. In the PE world, of course, if you were to sell your practice to private equity, you probably, on average, $1 million practice would probably garner somewhere between $900,000 and $1 million. So you can see that private equity about another 35 to almost 50% more than a typical peer-to-peer. One other thing I just want to leave you with in our first little 5-minute novella here this morning is that if you're thinking ahead, try not to incur a lot of debt in that 3 to 5 years before you sell your practice. A practice has to be sold net of its debt. So try to pay cash for a lot of your improvements, or don't take on an enormous amount of debt in that kind of 3 to 5 year period of time. And I was at a Vision Source meeting years ago, and a doctor came up and said, I've listened to you 5 times, and the best thing I ever got was a couple years ago when you said, don't take on a lot of debt 3 to 5 years before you sell your practice. So he said, I put all the equipment in, paid cash for it. So when I sold my practice, all the proceeds were net clear to me, which is very helpful. So there's just some ideas on value, and thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to contact us at the Williams Group, and we'll be certainly happy to discuss any of this further with you. Thanks.